Hello, everyone, and welcome to Dreamleapers with Harriet Cole. Today, we have a very special guest who's written a book that I have to tell you, it is a true heart opener. It will make you think, it will make you think about our history, the history of our country, the history of race relations in our country. It's really quite a powerful book, which is called These Walls Between Us, a memoir of friendship across race and class. And it's written by a woman named Wendy Sanford. I want to tell you about her. Wendy grew up in an upper middle class white suburban family in Princeton, New Jersey, and attended private schools throughout her life. During the socially turbulent time of the 70s, she became a feminist, a lesbian, and a Quaker. A founding member of the Boston Women's Health Book Collective, Wendy co authored and edited many versions of the women's health and sexuality classic, Our Bodies, Ourselves, from 1973 to 2011. In seminary at Harvard Divinity School in the 80s, she began to read works of women of color as devotional reading to remedy her previous exclusive exposure to white and mostly male authors. She served for nearly a decade in campus ministry in the Boston area. In her 50s, she began to reckon with her own white skin and the benefits that came to her through being white. In 2003, she earned an MFA in writing from Vermont College. And she is grateful to Mary Norman, who she writes about in detail in this book, for partnering with her to create this book. She lives in Cambridge, Massachusetts with Polly Atwood, her spouse of 41 years. Please join me in welcoming Wendy Sanford. Hello.
Hi, Harriet. I'm so happy to be here with you.
I am as well. And I have to tell you something. When I got this book and just started reading the first couple of pages, I was like, ooh, this is a very important book for a lot of reasons. There are many books about race. There are many books that talk about, that try to help us understand what's going on in our world, especially now, because we can use the inflection point of George Floyd when so many more people realize we have to pay attention. We have to pay attention differently to the way that we treat each other.
Mhm.
Uh, Very often, the people telling that story, waving the flag, are people of color. In particular, very often they are Black people.
Mhm.
And as we know, it can't just be Black people waving the flag or telling the story. It has to be that white people also participate in learning, in unpacking whatever their stories are, and
Mhm.
in figuring out what the truth actually is. And this book, These Walls Between Us, does that in incredible storytelling and detail. So I thank you for really having the courage to do the work, to do you can tell how much you have read and processed, and I mean, it's just really an incredible amount of work that I see that you have done. What made you decide to tell this story?
Whew. You're making me cry. Thank you
I've
for.
been crying with almost every page, by the way.
um, it means a lot to hear you what you see in the book. Thank you. This I have to go way back to say where
Sure.
this book came from. In I grew up, as you said, in a upper middle class white family in New Jersey, and when I was 12 years old, they decided my father was doing well enough, and we would go on a vacation into New England, and we they rented a little house on a beach, a very secluded beach, and my mother asked around among her friends who had women working for them, mostly African American domestic workers, who were called and girls at the time. We didn't dignify the work with the word domestic work. That's what it was. And so a young niece of one of my mother's domestic workers, well, friends, domestic workers, came way up from Southern Virginia to all by herself, traveled with the help of her aunt uh, to, uh, to help my mother out, and basically did all the hard work for the whole month so that my family could enjoy our vacation. And she was Mary was her name, Mary White at the time, now Mary Norman, and she was 15 years old. So as a white person in
You
my
were what?
social,
You were 12, right?
I was 12. And as
Right.
a white person in my social class at 15, I'd still be a girl. But Mary had been working all every Saturday since she was 11. Her family depended on her income. This was her first live-in job. And the reason she didn't, she had just graduated from high school because at that time, 1956, Virginia would not give anything more than a one-room schoolhouse to all the black children in her town. And the teachers had 15 or more kids of all ages, and they had taught Mary everything that this incredibly smart young woman could learn. So, and the idea, for her at that point socially was that she would go into domestic work like her mother and her grandmother. And so she arrived in this white upper middle class enclave on a deserted beach where there were, she wasn't even really allowed on the beach except in her uniform. I mean, and I was 12, totally clueless about where she came from, totally. But part of her job was to learn everything she could about me.
Mm.
And so that's how the relationship went for a while. And I was very self involved as a teenager, and she helped me through some things. Uh, and my mother was so pleased with Mary's work. She was very, very good at what she did. Even though she was so lonely out there, it was just really painful for her. But she was, doing something for her family, and she. So my mother begged her to come back year after year, summer after summer, uh, and that's Mary went on to a career in corrections, which is there's a lot in the book about her career in corrections and
Yes.
also on my website. And she had a really humane approach to corrections at a time when things were really turning bad in terms of corrections becoming more about punishment and not rehabilitation. But she was so a rehabilitation person, just incredibly humane. So uh, she would take her vacation from the correction center in New Jersey to work for my mother. And I once said to her, do you always, I mean, I loved seeing her because then I would go on
Sure.
vacation at the same time so we could see each other. But I said, do you always have to come? And she said, have you ever tried to say no to your mother?
Right.
And I, of course, said, oh, sure, I say no to her all the time. And then I stopped and I thought, I'm not an employee. I get to say no. Mary, to keep her job, doesn't get to say no. So, anyway, we became in our 40s, early 40s, suddenly we had more in common. And because of the feminist movement, which we can talk about more, I understood that we were both women and that we both had, there was a lot we had in common. There was a lot that was different, and I really needed to learn that part. But we started to talk. We were both single parents. We both were divorced. And she was working in corrections as the first female corrections officer in her county in New Jersey. And I was a feminist health activist. And we just started talking in a different way. And I had, uh, we just started talking in a different way about our lives and our work. And uh, after about 4 or 5 years of this, we began to look, that was the main thing we looked forward to, visiting or working for my parents. And that, we just began to really look forward to that. And Mary finally said to me, we should write a book. about our friendship.
So it was Mary's
It was
idea.
Mary. It was totally Mary because we had a great bookstore in Cambridge called New Words Bookstore, and they really curated their collection so that by going there and reading books, I was reading a lot of works by African American women. It was such a blossoming of literature in the 80s, 70s, and 80s, and I'd bring books and we'd talk about those. And one time we talked about Coming of Age in Mississippi by Anne Moody. I don't know if that's a book it's a
Mhm.
powerful, just this is how it was day by day by day by a woman who grew up in Mississippi as part of a family of sharecroppers and
Mhm.
and became active in the civil rights movement. And so I read that book. I I gave it to Mary. I said, "This book is teaching me so much. Would you just read it and tell me what you think?" And she read it in one night, and the next day she looked at me and she said, "Wendy, that book was my life."
Wow.
And everything I had never asked or known to ask her, suddenly I knew more because of Anne
Mhm.
Moody's work and her detailing of the fear, the hunger, the resilience of the family in the face of it all.
Mhm.
I knew more now about Mary than I ever had, and we had known each other for 20 years.
Wow.
So when
It's
she
interesting.
said,
You
"Go on,"
I want to say in the beginning of the book, when you describe that moment when Mary arrives, and
hmm
the first trip, the first engagement with your family, you talk about how Mary loved to read,
yes,
and immediately your mother shared books with her, and that became a connection for the family, I guess, not just you and Mary, but your mother and Mary, huh?
yes, very different kinds of books. My mother's were big hardbacks with princes and princesses on horses in the front, white people with long flowing hair. But what Mary said, as you saw in the book, is that she grew up with a very strict grandmother. She grew up with her grandmother. They were Methodists, a very uh, you know, uh, went to church every single Sunday and another day in the week. And she wasn't allowed to read anything like that, particularly the romantic part. So
Oh yeah.
she would just read and read and read. She just thought she was learning about the world. It was a bit of a warped world with those kind of, but she just really enjoyed it.
And
So,
which is so, just there's so many uh, themes that run throughout your book. But when I read about Mary in that one room school and then her love of reading,
mhm,
it also took me back historically. During slavery, black people were not allowed to read. You could be killed for reading. And then we look at what education has meant in the black community for so long. There's so many challenges in communities that don't have resources, and for Mary to be one who was able to uh, rise out of that experience, at least, to be able to see so much of the world through words is
mhm,
important. And then for this
mhm.
book to then share through incredible storytelling. I mean, I think that we see a lot of the stories that you share. I,
Good. I'm so
you,
glad.
yeah, yeah. So it was how long ago that Mary suggested that you work on this book together?
It was, well, we were in our 40s, and I'm now 77 and she's 81. So that was
Wow,
a good 40 years ago.
wow.
And I immediately said, yes, we're going to write a book. But Mary, of course, Mary then said, it's going to make us a lot of money, which was funny because memoir doesn't make much money unless you're a celebrity. Um, so, and then she said, and it's going to get us on Oprah because that was the year, I know that was the year Oprah started doing
The book club.
her book club.
Oh, I
Um,
love it.
so the interesting thing that developed is that we created the book together. We didn't write it together
Okay.
because I had discretionary time. I was an English
Sure.
major. I'd had a much more responsible education. It was just not an education that the state of Virginia
Sure.
offered. Um, and I kind of assumed that I could tell our story if I listened to her well enough. And I think the book took so long, partly because, well, there are a few reasons why it took 30 years to write. And uh, one is uh, I finally began to realize that when I asked her questions and then she talked to me and I wrote it all down, her life was filtering through my white gaze, as Toni
Yes.
Morrison calls it. And I didn't for quite a while see the problem with that. And so,
Mhm.
fortunately, it took so long that then I started reading more of Toni Morrison and more of, then the white accountability, white privilege movement came, and I
Sure.
started looking at the differences in our lives
Mhm.
uh, related to our skin color,
Sure.
and uh, to take more responsibility for that, and to finally, it just in the last 5 or 6 years, whenever texting came in, that rescued the book in a whole other way.
Wow.
Because with texting, Mary's voice can be in the book. She's still responding to me and she's still writing to me, but that's her voice and her
Her voice
story.
directly. Let me remind folks, you're listening to Dreamleapers with Harriet Cole here on WBAI in New York City. That's 99.5 FM and everywhere online at WBAI.org. And right now we are talking with Wendy Sanford, who has written a memoir called These Walls Between Us, a memoir of friendship across race and class. And Wendy, this book is just chock full of stories. I love that it took you so long, so that, in this sense, what you just described, you were able to process what you were experiencing in deeper and deeper ways.
Yes,
And
yes,
you do talk about, and I appreciate your mention of Toni Morrison and her saying, she said she created her work without thinking about the white gaze, which is a difficult thing to do, but she was a master writer and
yes,
storyteller.
yes.
Uh, but, that sense of the white gaze from a white person, I want you to talk about how you were able to recognize when that was the gaze that you had. And you talk about it in the book, but if you could give some examples of how you were able to recognize, and I'll give you one that you could
Oh,
start with.
good. Give me one so that
Yeah,
would
yeah.
help.
That's early in the book. You talk about how Mary, basically, it's about swimming. So
Mm,
if you Mary and her cousin Linda, who were coming to Nantucket who came to Nantucket to work for your family and had on their white pristine uniform, standing on the beach. I guess it was Linda who had said to her face said that she did not want to have her picture taken by your father on the beach, and he commented, "Well, Linda doesn't like to swim." Tell us what you
yes.
understand from that story in retrospect.
Oh boy. Thank you, Harriet. So both with Mary once when she first came that first summer, she's 15 years old. She's hundreds of miles away from home. She's never seen the ocean. And my mother, who's like a real swimmer and has taught me to swim, is down on the beach. And Mary comes to the edge of the steps going down to the beach. And my mother says, Mary, come on down and see come on down to the beach. I just hope you're going to love the water as much as Wendy and I do. And the ocean water in Black history in this country is about the Middle Passage. It's about being stolen from home and taken across the water, and on so many people dying. And it's just there's a history there that my mother and I had no awareness of at all. Later, that's the thing about memoirs, you have an experience and then you grow some more and you go back and you look. Later, I look back and I have hear my mother saying, "Come on down, Mary." And I look at the look on Mary's face
Mm,
as she stands at the top of the steps, and I understand so much. And also, uh, it, it wasn't just way, way back in the Middle Passage. It was that in Virginia, in most states in this country, black children weren't allowed to into public pools in the 50s and 60s. It took a long time to change that. So why would Mary have learned to swim? How would she have learned to swim? So it was such a clueless comment that I had no idea of until I started to read everything I could get my hands on about African American life, and mostly fiction, just mostly
mhm.
wonderful fiction. Um, and then Mary and I would share those books. But so that's, and then the other scene, it's just a photograph I've seen. I wasn't
Yeah.
there, but it's a photograph that my father took of Mary's cousin, because once in a while Mary wouldn't be able to come for that 4 weeks of the summer. And she'd send a cousin or a sister in her place. And Linda was her first cousin. They grew up on the same hill. Uh, in southwestern Virginia. And uh, my father took a picture of Linda in her white uniform on the beach with the water behind her. And I figured Linda felt the same way about the water that Mary did. It was fear and unknowing,
Sure.
and danger. And and I could just tell later on, looking back at that picture, that Linda was not, this was something she was doing because her boss wanted her to, which is to pose for a picture on the beach. And then in the photo album, my father wrote, "Linda does not like to swim."
Right.
So again, and he probably thought that was so clever. And in fact, it was totally ahistorical. It's like she had, for all the same reasons I just said, she had no opportunity to swim, and to learn. It was a dangerous thing for her. Is that the kind of thing you're thinking of? It's
Yes.
like you
That's it.
revisit it.
Yes. It's a powerful story that you examined in a lot of different ways. That's what I want people who are listening to get a sense of what you're talking about in this book, because it's far more than this beautiful relationship that you and Mary have. You pack in a lot of history and also contemplation. Like, oh, this
Mhm,
is what this meant in that moment, but this is what I've come to learn that it means.
mhm,
And the
mhm.
indignity of a lot of it, that I mean, I'm curious about how you have felt when you started learning and you realized, wow, this the way that my family behaved in
Mhm.
some instances was horrific. It was just
Yes.
unconscious. How did
Unconscious,
you feel?
supposed kind on the surface,
Yes.
but yeah.
How did you feel as you started understanding more deeply what this lack of understanding uh, meant?
Yes, and how it landed.
Yeah.
Uh, uh, I think that it's important for white people not who start to realize this, not to get lost in guilt, because that's focusing on ourselves more, getting all guilty. But I think I went through some of that, and then understood that that wasn't helpful. And my feeling was, it's really grief.
Mm.
That's what I would say. I said somewhere the other day that the book, in some ways, became for a while a grief memoir for my mother, who does die of alcoholism somewhere through the book, and that was a rough thing for Mary as a domestic worker, and rough for me as a daughter to care about someone who was destroying themselves through an illness. Um, but oh, I lost my point.
Well, actually, let me ask you something else.
Okay.
So I'm curious about how your did you talk to your parents about your relationship with Mary, and even when you became friends with her, as opposed to the dynamic of her being a servant in your household? How did your parents react to that?
Mary says she remembers that we used to have to whisper a lot. There's your answer.
Yep. Yeah, I can
I
imagine that based upon the way that you describe the elite nature of, especially your mother's family, right?
Mhm. Yes, exactly. You're such a good reader. You
Well, you
got
know
it.
what, Wendy, I am an author too, and I pride myself in reading my guests' books. I
Thank you.
haven't
It's
read
a
every word because I just got it, but I've read many of your stories.
mhm.
And, it's important to, in order to talk to you, to
Yes,
be able
thank you.
to have read your book, and it's really very moving. But you talk about the class breakdowns in your family, the
Mhm.
challenges between your parents because they come from two different um, class structures, even within white society. And so, just the idea that you and Mary would become friends struck me as something that your parents probably wouldn't think that that was the best idea.
Exactly, and there's one scene on the one of our after one of our beach walks, uh, when, we get to the end of the walk, and I say, "You know, Mom," 'cause I would complain about my mother to Mary. She would never complain about my mother to me,
Right.
but I would complain sometimes, and I said, "You know, Mom, I'm up here for just a week, and she keeps wondering when I'm gonna see my friends,"
Right.
which my mother meant my white friends,
Of course.
of course. And I realized immediately how that must have landed, and that I was implying to Mary that she wasn't one of my friends, or that it was a lesser, or whatever. And I just felt horrible, and just said, "Oh, that isn't what I mean at all," and da da da. But I'd said it. And that's when I think, when I learn about microaggressions and
Mhm.
how they're something that a white person can say that doesn't feel like it has much valence to them, but it plays into a whole history of insult. I understand that that was a microaggression, and that really hurt Mary's feelings. Even though I immediately said, "I don't mean that. You're my friend. You're my friend." It's like, so that's an
After you
example.
all started talking a lot and reading books and sharing stories and visiting independent of your parents, uh, how easy or difficult was it for you to go all the way in, and not so much even you, but her? How was she able to be more open, because she was taught to be good and kind and not talk back and not say how she felt? How did you get her to open up?
That's another reason the book took 30 years. It's like, I think that uh, we have been expanding the truths we can tell each other. And we're lucky. I'm grateful that we've lived long enough to keep doing that.
Mm,
Uh,
I get it. I mean, I think she was taught to be a particular way, which
exactly. And she had to be to keep her job.
and
That's
which
why
you
my,
describe in detail as she was so good that she was invisible.
exactly. And that's what white employers wanted, a black employee of domestic workers. And Mary did it very well. And also utterly deferential. So as we became friends, there is a real pattern in which Mary puts my comfort first. And then I
Mhm.
complain, which isn't very gracious at all. And then I try to slip in doing something for her. We're a riot together sometimes, because
Well,
it
it's
stay it
complicated.
stays. It is.
It's complicated. Let folks know you're listening to Dreamleapers with Harriet Cole here on WBAI in New York City. That's 99.5 FM and everywhere online at WBAI.org. And today we're talking with Wendy Sanford, who has written a memoir with stories. You get your tissues out, y'all, because you can't help but feel the emotion in the book and in the stories. And I think that the tears that have come from me, anyhow, have been just a heart opening tears. And the book is called These Walls Between Us, a memoir of friendship across race and class. And Wendy shares many stories about her relationship with who was first a girl who came, literally a girl who came to
Hmm.
work
Literally.
with her family at their summer place on Nantucket and grew into a lifelong friendship. And you may have a copy of this book, which Wendy so graciously has offered to us. When you make a donation of $50 to WBAI, you will receive a copy of These Walls Between Us, a memoir of friendship across race and class. And as you know, those of you who are WBAI listeners, we are 100% listener supported, which means it is you who are part of this covenant that we are experiencing right now in Dreamleapers and every other program on WBAI. It is you who love this radio station so much, who offer your hard earned dollars to make sure that we stay in business. And we should be proud of ourselves. We survived through COVID,
Mm.
where so many businesses have perished. Beloved businesses all over this country and beyond. We are 61 years old and still going strong, in part, I think, because we tell the truth and we bring incredible guests like our guest today, Wendy Sanford, on to show us different ways of examining the world and pursuing our dreams. And that's what Dreamleapers is all about. I want you to be inspired by the guests that I bring on so that you will pay attention to the dream in your heart and help to unlock it. And sometimes, like in Wendy's case, this dream, anyhow, that's 40 years of uh, in the making, in a sense, but a much longer relationship, even than that, is looking at the truth of tender relationships in a culture that twists so many things that it's hard to figure out what the truth is. So, again, this book is called These Walls Between Us, a memoir of friendship across race and class. Your donation of $50 to WBAI will give you a copy of this book from Wendy. You can call us at 212 209 2950. I'll repeat that, 212 209 2950. And you can also go online at give to the numeral 2 WBAI.org. And what you do with the call or online is you just let them know you've been listening to Dream Leapers, you're making a contribution of $50, and that you want this book, these Walls Between Us, and it will be yours. So that's pretty great. I tell you, this is a book that you can read. You could create your own book club with your friends and read it and talk about it. There's so many things to think about, so much history that frames what the gaze was for Wendy, what the gaze was for Mary. And Wendy, you really go into that in interesting detail. Like you talk about the 50s and how what your life was like. What was Elvis Presley and the uh, bobby socks and short skirts and all of those things. And then for Black people, it was segregated theaters and sitting at the back of the bus and lynchings were still going
Yes.
on. Unfortunately, they're still going on now, but in great numbers. As you did that research to contextualize what your life was like and what Mary's life was like, um, when you were first learning these differences in your experiences of the same thing, tell us about that process for you of just seeing life really was different. What Mary experienced is not what I experienced.
Yeah. Um, it was profound. It was painful. Uh, and fascinating that we could have been living in such different realities.
Yep.
And I also came to understand more and more that it was socially constructed. This
Mm.
wasn't about Mary's and my personalities or our family personalities. It was socially constructed. And for instance, I'll give you an example. Um, there's a scene in the book where my mother's driving through the a less affluent part of town as a shortcut, and
Yeah.
the place where a lot of immigrants and African Americans lived in Princeton, New Jersey, was at that time was Witherspoon Street, and we drive fast through that street because, and I'd actually close my windows because I was scared of those kids. And where does that fear come from? It's socially constructed. It
Sure.
is, and I didn't know that at the time. And and then when my mother was trying to teach me good taste in clothes, when
Mm-hmm.
I picked out a dress that was like too colorful or something like that, she'd say, "Oh, that dress is too Witherspoon Street."
Mm.
So she was teaching me that the people who lived in that area had poorer taste, uh, and were, and the whole implication was their houses were less fancy than mine, and so, and were kind of run down, and that it was somehow their fault. So imagine when I started reading, particularly Ta-Nehisi Coates's work
Right.
about a case for reparations, that in fact that poverty was also socially constructed.
Yes.
With the GI after GIs came back from World War II, white GIs, there was this whole thing in the GI Bill that you could get a good mortgage, a really
That's right.
affordable mortgage, and that's how so many white middle class families uh, built into the middle class because they had houses, and then they could sell those and for a better house, and they could develop equity. The black people who had fought in the same war and came back couldn't take advantage of the GI Bill because of banking policies and federal housing policies that wouldn't give mortgages to Black people in certain neighborhoods, or would try to limit them to neighborhoods that were considered poorer neighborhoods. So they, now you look at the huge wealth gap, and people still imply that it's because Black people don't work hard enough, which has been a lie since the start.
Right.
But the wealth gap is really explainable by a federal housing policy, among other things, that socially constructed this wealth gap. So I just started to, so imagine as I start to read
Yes.
that and learn that and think of my mother saying a dress was to Witherspoon Street.
Mm.
It's, you know, you revisit your life with new understanding, and you say, how did it feel? I've already talked about not wanting to go to guilt. I also think that all the feelings around seeing what I didn't know and the cruelty of what was and what still is, um, uh, fueled my desire to make this a really good book. And I began to feel that as a white person who grew up in this way, the best I can give is to be as honest as I can about
Mm-hmm.
how I was shaped, what I didn't see, how I came to learn what I do see. And the big motivation for me, in addition to just justice, is loving Mary,
Mm-hmm.
and
Now,
that's the.
here's an interesting question, Wendy. And I'll give it from this context. Again, we are in this space of racial reckoning right now, and I know that a lot of people are tired of talking about it. I know that a lot of white people have said, look, I gave to this charity or that one. Corporations have done that. You know, I just want to live my life and do my job. I don't want to talk about it anymore. There's that. Not all, of course, but a
But
lot.
there's a
And
bunch of
then
it.
a lot of it. And then there are plenty of other people who summarily reject the idea that there's anything about them or their lives that is racist or that is, or this notion of white privilege.
Hmm.
So I'm curious, as you have been talking about your book to white people, because you say that you've written this primarily to white people so that
Hmm.
they can understand how how are they reacting? Because a lot of times people say, I don't want to know this. How are people react? How are white folks reacting to your book?
You know, that's a very interesting question. I hang with a lot of with white people who would care about this book.
Got it.
So I have friends and associates who are so happy to see it and so glad it's out there. I just had a college classmate just wrote today and said, "This book is really making me think. I think everyone
Yeah.
should read it." So I sometimes say it's a book for well-intentioned white people. You know, it's for white people who say, "I want to have a black friend," or "My black friend, my one black friend," or whatever. And don't understand the barriers we carry in ourselves to interracial friendship. Like, have you been asking that one black friend to teach you about racism? Not a good idea. Go find out for yourself and
Right.
bring that knowledge to the friend, right?
Sure.
So I think there are people who will not be interested in this book at all, and I don't know how to reach them. But I think there are a bunch of well-intentioned white people who who really seriously want to know, what can I do differently, and how can I learn? And for me, part of how I learned is just reading like crazy. I stopped reading books by white people, which I read a few, but that's really a policy that I have, because the whole first part of my life, that's all I read.
Hmm. Yeah, you
Um,
write about that in your book as well. I have a very, very dear friend who grew up at the height of white privilege. And when she went to college, she chose to study Black literature. And over the course of, I mean, we've known each other since we were in our 20s.
mhm,
Over the course of our friendship, we both have learned different things about our families. Some of the things that she's learned about her family horrify her.
mhm,
That
mhm.
a member of her family was close friends with someone who was a leader of the KKK. She's like, what do I do with that?
Yeah.
And there's things that we learn sometimes about our families that can be very difficult. You share things about your family that were very elitist. How did you reconcile the elitism of your own parents, especially your mother, to what you have discovered about institutional racism and just even being able to be a friend to Mary?
Uh, as I say in the book, at one point, it's really tempting to uh, capture my parents' racism and elitism, like it's a moth that I'm going to pin to the wall. And humility is really what I think I need to bring to it. That they were taught well by their families and their cultures, and they were doing what they had been taught. Uh, it was so I try to record what they did without blaming, because plus I think memoirs where you're blaming somebody are usually pretty boring. So in terms of like just blaming my parents, but
Sure.
it is horrifying, and I think, to be honest, some of what was painful for Mary in reading the book as it developed was hearing some of the things my parents said that they
Mm,
didn't say to her. They weren't
right.
overt racists in that talking nasty way, but they were. That's what they'd learned and what they were. When so I think reading some of the things they said that I felt I needed to be honest about and put it all out there. What else was this book going to be good for, useful for, if I wasn't really telling the truth? Some of that was really painful for Mary to read, and there were times when I thought, "Is this something I shouldn't be doing?" And Mary eventually said, "I need to know this," because she was 15 years old when she came. My
Sure.
mother was kind to her. She loved my parents,
Sure.
and was incredibly loyal to them all throughout her life, and they loved her. And as Toni Morrison, as the narrator of The Bluest Eye says at the
Mm,
end, love is never any better than the lover.
mm.
And so my parents loved her, but there were such limits. Uh, there were such limits.
It's interesting. As I started reading your book, I thought again about my friend who I just mentioned, and
Mhm.
a couple years ago, she said to me that she wanted the two of us to take a trip down each of our families' stories and
Mm.
create something where we would talk about it. And as I am reading your book, I'm like, oh, we should revisit that because
Mhm.
the especially when you really are close to someone who's from a very different experience than yours, and you have the ability to talk about it openly and without judgment. Because like you said, that guilt part. If you put guilt in there, then it's just impossible, I think,
Mhm.
sometimes to move forward because the weight of guilt is so tremendous. But what you have done, yes, this book will make you cry, everybody who's listening, but they're good tears. They're like tears of recognition and awareness, and healing, I think, even. So what let me tell you all, what am I talking about? I'm talking about this book by Wendy Sanford called These Walls Between Us, a memoir of friendship across race and class. This book, is just absolutely filled with so many incredible stories about Wendy and her friend who started out as a domestic worker in her home when she was 15 years old and Wendy was 12, and they developed a friendship. And this book is their friendship plus a history lesson, many history lessons. And I highly recommend it. And Wendy very graciously has offered books to us. And so, for all of you who are interested, if you make a donation of $50 to WBAI, you will receive a copy of Wendy's book, These Walls Between Us, a memoir of friendship across race and class. And you just call us at 212-209-2950, or go online to give to the numeral 2 WBAI.org. Let folks know that you've been listening to Dreamleapers, that you heard Wendy, and that you want this book. And you can make a donation to make sure that our beloved radio station continues to thrive. And you get something, I promise you, you're going to want to talk about this. This is not just a book that you read and, oh, that's nice. This is a book that stirs up a lot and challenges us to think differently. And one of the things that I appreciate so much that Wendy has done is she's telling you the truth that she's read a lot. She has read and processed so many great African American writers and includes them at perfect moments in the book to give context to better understanding of what it means to be white and privileged in America, what it means to be black and not necessarily privileged in America, what different decades have meant to the ability to move through space for white folks and for black folks. And so I highly recommend it. Again, These Walls Between Us, a memoir of friendship across race and class. Call us at 212-209-2950, or go online at give2wbai.org. Make your pledge of $60 and ask for this book, and it will be sent to you. So, Wendy, I want to tell you something. My maternal grandmother, who was born in 1889 and lived to be 101 years old,
Mm.
was a domestic worker until she was 93. And my mother said, "You must stop." And, and I talk about her a lot. Um, well, I loved her so. I named my
Mm.
daughter for her.
What
And
was her name?
Carrie Freeland.
Carrie
Freeland,
Freeland.
Freeland, Carrie
Yes,
Freeland.
Carrie Freeland.
And my grandmother was a white skinned black woman with blue eyes and straight hair. We believe that her father was European, but nobody will say. Uh, she was 4'9". I'm 5'9" and change, so she was tiny compared to me, and had the biggest personality, and was such a sweet person. I tell the story that I'm going to tell you now, but with reading your book, it's stirred up more in me. I have to explore it more because of your book. So I remember when I was in the 70s. I was young in the 70s, and I was mad. This is Black Power movement. And I'm like, why? I'm from Baltimore. My grandmother worked for very wealthy Jewish families. It's a large Jewish community in Baltimore. And I said, Grandma, You don't need to work anymore. And why are you working for these rich white people anyway? We can take care of you. And she sat me down very sternly and said, Young lady, you don't have to worry about me. I love my work and I love the people I work for. And when it comes your time to work, your responsibility is to love the people you work for and with and to love what you do. And I have told this story so many
Mm,
times when often one lesson that I've learned from this story is to not look at people in a stereotypical way. You know, that my grandmother didn't do that. She looked at it through the lens of love for
mm,
everything.
mhm.
That is what I often speak to. But when I read your book, I also know that she had to be kind. She had to be gracious. She
Mhm.
had to take care of
Willing,
these people
willing.
and will and she had to be invisible. And those are things that I haven't thought about so much. But you talk about that and how the invisibility that had to be for many of these people. Now, I don't know. In the end, I think that she became family with a lot of these folks. But your book stirred up in me some of these emotions that, it's not one way. That was the only work she could do. She had a third grade education,
Mhm. Right.
and so as you have been learning more, even now you've completed this book, what emotions are still stirred up for you?
Well, as you talk about what's how the book is striking you and what you're noticing, so many emotions. Um, I think I started to say earlier that that for part of this book, it was really a grief memoir for my mother,
Mm,
and then I came to understand that the deeper grief was about the structured oppression that hurt my friend Mary,
mm,
because there's grief about that.
sure.
Um, so that's one response. Also, just gratitude. That Mary and I made a lot of mistakes in the friendship, and I chronicle those in the book.
Hmm.
Some really cringe-worthy moments. Uh, uh, like when I said, "Well, you really were like one of the family, weren't you?" And she says, "Well, not really, because when your mother died, you all were totally focused on yourselves, and you didn't understand that I'd also lost someone who was like a mother to me."
Ooh,
That was so painful to hear from her. And But that's after we've been friends for a long time. I said that to her, so that I did make a lot of mistakes, and so I feel gratitude that we've lived long enough uh, to um, to learn from those mistakes that I have, and that we have moved on. And I remember, I'll tell you two things. When Mary turned 70, she's had a lot of health problems, because that's another theme in the book,
yes.
is the taxing nature of the work that she's done, and of the stress of being Black in a racist society,
Mhm.
and the work that's being done in research, actually, that the stress of racism, claims this one researcher, actually weathers the body and
I'm sure.
creates more age, makes you older. Um, so that health is one of the themes in the book. And uh, uh, on my 70th birthday, she wrote me a card and said, "My present to you is that I'm going to try to live to 80,"
Wow.
which she knew what that would mean to me.
Mm.
And she did.
Mhm.
Um, she did. And so now, we chat, every week or more. I mean, during COVID, we actually talked every day. During the first few months of the lockdown, we talked every day, just to help each other through. So I feel a lot of gratitude. I know that we'll be, because of COVID, we haven't seen each other, but we suddenly discovered that we both that we we Zoom together, so now we at least see each other.
Look,
Uh,
the wonders of technology. Believe it or not, our time has come to an end. It zipped by.
oh, it
Wendy,
did.
thank you so much. I just want to remind folks Wendy Sanford's book is These Walls Between Us, a memoir of friendship across race and class. And it really is a look through Wendy's eyes, through
Hmm.
her experience, through her research at her relationship with Mary, who a black woman who they met when they were teenagers and have really children. I mean, you were 12,
Really,
that's
children.
you were children. And they've remained friends all these years, and Wendy has written this book that really explores their relationship, that explores race relations. And I'm glad you say class too, because that's so important and part of the dynamics of challenge in our country. So you may have a copy by making a $50, I keep saying $50 contribution to WBAI. Uh, just ask for These Walls Between Us. Wendy, thank you so much. Thank you for writing this book and for
Mm.
sharing it with us. We appreciate you.
Thank you, and I loved this interview, and I have this vision that you will interview Mary at some point.
I would
Uh,
love to. I
so
would love to.
be in touch about that.
I
Because
will. Thank
yeah,
you. I would
yeah,
love that.
yeah.
Thanks so much. Hey guys, you've been listening to Dream Leapers with Harriet Cole here on WBAI. Thank you so much for being with me. You definitely should call and get this book right away, These Walls Between Us, a memoir of friendship across race and class. Until next time, have a great day and make it count.